Now there is more to the sub than just the heading part of it. So we have the line end sub, and this just simply indicates the end of the sub procedure. This will always be the last line of the sub. So whenever we get to this line, think of it like a return statement in other programming languages that says we're done with the sub, so now we can go back to whichever method or sub called that particular sub. Now we also have statements that are between the header and the end sub line. We call this the body of the sub. And this would be the code that we execute when the sub is called. So if we go back to our write labels sub example from earlier, we'd have these lines as part of our body. So we mentioned before that we would set the text of label 1 to str1, and we would set the text of label 2 to str2. But all the code that's between the header and the end sub line would be part of the body of our sub. Once a sub is created and defined, we can now use it. It's not enough to just create the sub. It doesn't do us any good if we don't actually use it in our programs. So the way we do that is we would actually call the sub. We would tell the program we want to use this sub. So the question is, how do we call a sub? Well, to make this work in Visual Basic, we need three things. The first thing we need is the keyword call. This is unique to Visual Basic. Other programming languages do not require the word call, but here we have to include the word call. The rest of it is similar to other programming languages. We next need the name of the sub. So if we're going to call a sub, we need to know which one we're calling. So we need the name of the sub, and then we would have our pair of parentheses, and then we would have any arguments that would be passed to the sub. So as I mentioned, this is similar to other programming languages. The only difference is we would not have the word call in like C or in Java. We would just have the name of the sub, the parentheses, and then the arguments. But here, we would have the same thing, except we must include the word call in front of our sub procedure and arguments. So the value of each argument in our sub call would be stored in one of the parameters of our sub definition. So as we mentioned before, our arguments can be variables, they can be values, they can be whatever we want, but the idea is we're going to actually take the value of the argument and store it in the sub. If it's a by-val parameter, we would just directly copy the value into the parameter. If it's a by-ref parameter, then we're actually accessing the argument directly. And the one thing we got to keep in mind is the order does matter. So the first argument would be stored in the first parameter, the second argument would be stored in the second parameter, and so forth. And because this order does matter, it means there are some things that we have to keep in mind. The first thing is that the number of arguments must match the number of parameters. If I have a sub with 3 parameters and I try to call that sub using only 2 arguments, it's not going to work. I'm going to get some type of exception or error when I try to run it. So the number of arguments must match the number of parameters. The other thing that's important is that the data types of the respective arguments and parameters must match. For example, if my first parameter is an integer, my first argument in the subcall better be an integer. If it's a string, that's not going to work. I'm going to get an exception. So we need to make sure that the number of arguments and parameters match, and we need to make sure that the respective arguments and parameters have the same data type. Let's go back to our write labels sub procedure from before, and let's see how we would actually call that sub. So just as a reminder, here is the sub definition. So we have private sub write labels. We see that we have str1 as a string. It's a by-val parameter, which means we would copy the argument into str1. And if we made any changes to str1, we wouldn't change the argument at all. And then we have str2 as our other parameter. It's a string, and it's also a by-val parameter. And we see that we're going to take these parameters and store them in the text properties of label 1 and label 2 respectively. Now that we remember what the method does, let's take a look at how we would call it. So we would have this line here. So we start with the word call, and then we have the name of the sub, write labels. We have our parentheses, and then we see we have 2 arguments. One is the string enter name here, and the other one is the string click here to process. And notice that we're using the actual strings. We're not passing variables. We can do either one. This is perfectly fine where we just pass the string value itself without it being in a variable, or we could create a string variable, store these strings in the variables, and then pass those. Either way is perfectly fine here. So what we see what's going to happen here is that enter name here is going to be stored in str1 whenever we call this sub procedure, so that gets copied into str1. And then we would see that click here to process would be stored in str2. And we see that this will work because the number of arguments match number of parameters, both have 2. And we see that the types would match because both arguments are strings and both parameters are strings. Let's do one more example of calling our method. And we said before that we can use variables if we want to. Well, here's the example. So in this case, we're seeing that we can use variables as arguments in our subcalls. And what happens here is that the values that are in the variables would be stored in the parameters. So instead of passing the string value directly, we'll store it in the variable, we'll pass the variable, and whatever is in the variable will get stored in the parameter. So here, enter name here is still going to be stored in str1 because we see that the string enter name here is going to be stored in the string variable lb1 str. And then we see that click here to process would still be stored in str2 because we see that that string is being stored in lb2 str. And those two variables are being passed as the arguments for this sub.